because those two different sides might use the same tools and happen online, people sometimes have a difficulty distinguishing a political action from a criminal action. So there's a lot of examples that I have in here, and I might not get to talk about all of them, but here, for instance, you see on the left, the Iranian Ministry of Culture and Islamic Guidance has a foreign press and media department, and it has an English language website, of course, also in French and in German, Italian, Spanish, of course, Arabic, not just Farsi, but Arabic, and Russian and Japanese and Turkish. And they give foreign journalists guidance as to what is acceptable in Iran and what is not. On the right, you see a post on social media that was reposted on a blog by an American academic with a call. It says, please try to hack all Iran government websites. This is a tweet from an Iranian activist. And by hack, they don't mean just intrude, but they call for a distributed denial of service attack, DDoS. There'll be a lot of acronyms on these slides. I will explain some of them, and we can ignore some of the acronyms. But where it says on the right, DDoS, does anybody here know what that means? Or should I explain? A distributed denial of service, as one person who's heard that before, basically means that you gather as many computers or participants as possible to slow down or stop the ability of, for instance, the computer that's serving the website on the left from responding to requests. So denial of service means we will slow down or stop this computer by tying it up in processes that make it slow or irresponsive. So I'm going to come down to the front row and demonstrate this in a way that is kind of risky in COVID-19 times, but I will, I can't not. So what I was doing is I was initiating a handshake and then interrupting it, and then initiating a handshake and interrupting it. So basically, when your computer or your phone makes a request from this website, but then doesn't go through with the request, and we do this as thousands of people at the same time, or 10,000, 100,000, or you can program your computer to keep iterating this, and what I just did with her, then you tie up that computer in loops that prevent it from doing much else, right? So just as she was puzzled, because she knows I'm not going to shake her hand in the coronavirus day, but she still couldn't resist kind of trying to meet my hand, right? So the computer is going to try to respond to your request. It's pretty harmless. I think what I just did was not an attack on her person. It was apparently friendly, it was apparently normal to initiate contact. But if you do this as a distributed denial of service, right? Imagine that all of us here in the room are trying to shake her hand at the same time. She will be unable to do anything else but try to figure out, or even all of us at the same time say hello to her. You know, it becomes overwhelming. It becomes too much noise, and you don't know who is talking to you. So that's one of the basic techniques of online demonstration, of activist demonstration. I'm going to try to distinguish that very sharply from other things that might be an attack on computers in Iran. So what's called for here, to be very clear, is an activist asking other people outside Iran to hack websites, but not by changing them or breaking into them, but just to tie them up so that they become irresponsive. And that's one example for what we call hacktivism. So hacktivism as a word is a portmanteau, is a combination of hack and activism. It's largely defined as cyber attacks that further the goal of political groups, social groups that want to call attention to a particular cause or a particular protest. Everything from anti-piracy measures, we are not happy that we are prevented from making copies, to the whaling industry, right? There are some people, some animal rights activists in international waters who will try to physically block a Norwegian or a Japanese ship. But if we do this online, what is our ability, if I can't get on the boat with Greenpeace or with Greta to protest somewhere in a harbor physically, if I can't link arms with you at the front door of Unicinos, what is my online equivalent? What's my online protest, right? So we know that cyber attacks, malicious attacks that are criminal, that are trying to take your money or take your credentials, etc., are becoming more widespread. But it seems as if hacktivism, the kind of use of the same tools to protest online, seem to be in decline. There are multiple threat actors that you might read about in the newspaper, such as Guccifer 2.0 or the shadow brokers. These are cyber operators who claim to be activists, but they're not. They're actually state-sponsored groups, often connected to nation states like North Korea or Russia. They will do whatever it takes to achieve certain aims that are not protest. They're not activism. They're not animal rights or human rights motivated. They're motivated by particular nation-state aims. But they will sometimes call themselves hacktivists. So that's why I'm trying to be careful about what are we actually talking about when we talk about hacktivism. In a way, I think we should go back to not just what that looks like, but also to some political history that might explain why some of these things that you see up here, I think, are the equivalent of the free speech movement in the 60s, or animal rights movements, or anti-war, anti-Vietnam demonstrations, etc. So there are four techniques, four attacks that we usually see in online activism. The denial service that I tried to explain is the most popular one. It just basically makes that entity, that corporation, that agency become invisible temporarily. It takes them offline temporarily. It slows them down. A step further would be that you actually deface their websites and accounts. Now already, if you do this to a company, let's invent a company very quickly so I don't have to talk about real examples too much. I have some real examples, but let's invent, I don't know, agua.com, right? If I do a defacement of a public-facing website or their accounts, the Twitter account, whatever, and I make fun of agua.com, I might think this is fun. I might think that this is effective. I might think that this is a protest against whatever it is I'm unhappy with, the quality of the water, the lack of filtering of the water, the fact that they sell it in plastic bottles, or whatever I'm unhappy with. But they're already going to argue that unlike with the denial of service, which just takes them off for a while, a defacement of their website or their account is an attack. I would still say that it's the same thing as holding up a poster or a placard, in real life, or spraying their poster, making fun of their advertisement. The third technique is to release sensitive data. And that's probably, you agree, a little bit more aggressive. And the fourth level is to actually take over certain accounts, to really take control of some of their online assets. So here you have a little table. On the left you see the desired effect or impact, and on the right you see what tools could be used to do that. And without going through a lot of technical stuff, I'm also myself not up on all of the latest technical approaches, although I used to dabble in this 20 years ago. You can see that there's different levels of doing that, and it becomes progressively more technical. It becomes something that you can't just do as an ordinary citizen. It becomes more specialized. And it's an arms race, right? It used to be pretty easy, and as companies and government agencies become more paranoid and more security conscious, it becomes more difficult. It used to be that you could go to certain corners on the web and just download a script and run that on any of your ordinary computers. You didn't have to know exactly what it was going to do, and you were participating in a protest. Nowadays, it's more likely that you actually have to understand what that does, that you actually have to have some computer science basics to do, for instance, the SQL injection. Do you see that in the middle? SQL is a language that helps with databases. So you have to know something about database programming in order to execute that effectively. The problem is, this is still relatively easy for somebody who knows what that is, because databases, that's what computers are very good at. They keep a lot of data. And if you run a company, an insurance company or a credit card company or whatever, you're going to have a lot of databases. A lot of them have to be available to other computers, because that's how business is conducted. And so a lazy type of company will leave them unprotected, which means that somebody who knows what to do to undermine a database often can do that pretty easily. A watering hole attack, you might wonder what that is. That sounds like something from the zoo, not from computing. It basically says you're going to go to where people gather online, not offline, not literally at a watering hole, but for instance, you go to LinkedIn, or you go to certain kind of Reddit subreddits where people who work in a particular area exchange opinions, where they gather, like lions at a watering hole, or elephants or whatever, and you just listen to them and you pretend to be one of them. I've been able to do that. I know where the local office of Google is. And they, unlike most Google offices, they don't have their own cafeteria, but they have a restaurant right in front of the building. So if you go to have lunch at that restaurant, you will inevitably hear some gossip about what Google is working on that day. So you can get some information, and the more information you have, the more you can, the next line below watering hole attacks, the more you can social engineer your way into obtaining an access. Right? Because now you can pretend that you're working on that project. It's a large corporation. Not everybody knows everybody. I look like a lot of other people. I can look like a lot of other people online. So some of these attacks are not necessarily very technical. They're more, socially clever. At the bottom, in the theft of key accounts, that's really something that involves quite a few technical steps, and I couldn't teach you that today even if I wanted to. So like I said, the aims of such protests, did we lose? I lost some signal down here. the aims of such steps have to do with actually a pretty respectable history of protest. There are all kinds of political activism precedents. The civil rights movement in the United States, for instance, is one example, calling for equal rights for people of different races, calling for voting rights, etc. So the civil rights movement is one history where people are protesting in public, where they exercise their free speech. Here you see students in the late 60s. Famously, Berkeley is one hotbed of that movement, but many other places around the US and around the world in the 60s experienced student protests, student uprising against all kinds of policies, against institutions, against the university in some cases. And of course, then you have the Vietnam or other anti-war movements. There were anti-Iraq war protests. There were just pretty much anything that you disagree with, you are liable to see people taking to the street with signs or with music or marching or just standing by the road and asking drivers to honk and support whatever your protest might be. Right? So there's a long tradition of that as a level of free expression. And now that a lot of this has moved online, colleagues of mine like Shiva Vaidyanathan at University of North Carolina or Virginia are saying that we need to explain more to ordinary citizens about how this would be possible online and help people to make sense of important phenomena such as copyright policy, electronic voting, encryption, libraries, the preservation of different cultural traditions, and what the market is for cultural production. And if there's ever something in there that you feel disadvantages you or is biased, then just like you could go to the street and protest against certain policies, you should be able to go online and express yourself in protest against that. So if you want to be really literally historical about this, we can go back to the 1980s when there was a group in Texas and they ended up calling themselves the Cult of the Dead Cow. Recently a book was published about the history of that group that showed that, interestingly, one of the US presidential candidates, Beto O'Rourke, in this election in the US was a member of the Cult of the Dead Cow. That wasn't really announced until he had dropped out of the race because he could have hurt his chances of being seen as electable. Anyway, that was an early hacker group. There are many other hacker groups that emerged in the 90s, not just in the US, but around the world. And in a moment, I'll try to talk about some of them in this part of the world. They basically became known as people who can operate computers without a manual. And that used to be a point of pride. You learn to use the machine, and remember, there wasn't formal instruction for computers at that point anyway. You learn to use the machine, and you learn to express yourself through the computer and through the network without a manual. Right? That was the original meaning of hacker. Right? You just figure it out. You're an autodidact, self-taught computer expert. And they became recognized for their expertise enough that they would actually be called to testify to Congress, for instance, about internet security, about internet policy, about copyright, about fraud and abuse online, etc. So these are groups that collect their expertise, that get together not just to learn and teach each other, but also to spread the word about what is possible with computers and with the internet. Some of them very clearly also break laws, still go on to break laws, and they're called black hat. Some of them are called white hat. This is like a U.S. Western movie convention, right? The white hat means you're a good guy. The black hat means you're the villain. But most of these groups would be defined as gray hat. They're sort of in between. They do some things that help the public. They do some things that clearly are not legal by the current legal situation of the country. And they do some things to just benefit themselves or for a laugh that may not be beneficial, that may not be benevolent, but they do it anyway. In the contemporary context, each country has tried to shore up its protections in different ways. In the United States, you're dealing with a particularly restrictive legal situation. For instance, the Patriot Act that allows the government to basically invoke wartime security every day. Which has negative consequences for anybody who's politically active. For instance, if you want to protest against global warming and you can invoke expertise, that has been dampened and made difficult simply by the government trying to control scientific discourse and steering funding away from people who testify too loudly about global warming. Or if you're interested in digital rights management, which is copy protection of music, of movies, of game software, etc., it's very restrictive. These have been seen by protesters as attacks on principles of sovereignty and of self-determination. And in some cases, the US tends to export its view of what you are allowed to do with a computer, what you are allowed to do with a film, and try to apply that globally and actually try to criminalize people globally who do things that the United States corporations do not like. So it actually causes attacks on regional self-determination elsewhere, right? It tends to impose on other countries a very restrictive view based on US law. It certainly has caused speech to be constrained in technical platforms, right? You cannot say or show whatever you want on Facebook or Twitter. It comes with the territory that you have internet surveillance and content blocking and increasing threats to net neutrality. Now, without going into all kinds of nostalgic anecdotes about how I learned about these things, I just want to point out that in February 2000, so 20 years ago, the internet had become recently very privatized, and a lot of companies were putting a lot of effort, a lot of money into building websites that would be e-commerce websites. This is before the e-commerce crash, so everybody's trying to be online, selling things online, and there was some misgivings about this among people who had been led to believe that the internet is not just for commerce, but that the internet is for people and whatever people want to do and express themselves. So a number of commercial websites were taken offline by denial of service attacks, and a lot of universities seemed to be involved, including the university that I was a graduate student at. And I spent a lot of time on the phone with the FBI, and the only good thing that came out of it for me is that I was quoted by Newsweek, which is a large national weekly magazine, in a special issue called Hijacking the Net. where they had a story about holes in the net. And instead of treating me like a suspect, they treated me like an expert, which was nice. A change of hats, right? A gray hat, black hat, white hat, whatever. So I was proud to get that quote. You can't really read it, but on top left you see blah, 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 says Peter Kropp of the University of California. But then in a very not so subtle way, the bottom 2/3 of the page simply says, the market will rule. E-commerce is going to figure it out. You know, these protesters who are trying to alert people to problems about the commercialization, the privatization of the internet, they might cause some noise right now, but in the end, e-business will fix this glitch. So let's distinguish between different kind of activism that we can all recognize are similar, but not necessarily hacktivism. Right? So things that I may or may not have been involved with were not as involved as what you see here. I don't know if anybody remembers this, but also in about 15 years ago, there's a group, they still work occasionally, but not as active. There's a group called the Yes Men, and they do political pranks. And one of their pranks was to get one of their members here, actually quite recognizable. He's not wearing a mask or hiding his identity, but he passed himself off successfully as a spokesperson for Dow Chemical. And so instead of a protest, a denial of service, whatever, a march against Dow Chemical polluting, what the Yes Men came up with was the idea, we're going to pretend to be official Dow Chemical spokespeople, and we're going to go on BBC, and we're going to accept full responsibility. And we're going to say, yes, Dow is responsible for chemical spills in the ocean, and Dow will pay. Not hacktivism, right? It's tactical media activism. It uses television. It used the gullible, in this case, gullible BBC, which is otherwise a very respectable outlet, and it tricked them into thinking that they're talking to a real representative of a multinational corporation. The Electronic Disturbance Theater is another one of those groups. In this case, they did a virtual sit-in in support of a particular Mexican political cause. This had to do with suppression of political activists in the southernmost state, in Chiapas, where there was a political movement that was also rapidly becoming an armed movement and therefore declared terrorists by the Mexican state. And in support of them, in sympathy with them, you could use the applet. An applet is a small piece of programming that you could load on the website. Here, Netscape, you probably don't know what Netscape is because that predates your birth, but it's an old browser. So in your browser, pretend this is your browser. You could invoke an applet and then send a message, a pre-written, pre-formatted message to not to somebody's email account, but to the error log of certain kinds of institutions in Mexico. So for instance, here you see the stock exchange, Bolsa Mexicana de Valores. So, you know, you're going to try to attack them with multiple messages, and it's called a virtual sit-in, simply because it's going to flood them with incoming data, trying to slow down their daily business. Right? It's not an attack. It's not a prank either. It's a virtual sit-in. Echelon. Does anybody know what Echelon stands for? Echelon was revealed by an investigative journalist who testified to the European Parliament about a global network of listening stations that was hoovering up information from everywhere on the internet automatically. It was just automatically listening to everything that was sent around the internet. This has become harder every year because incrementally we send more and more data around, and of course in those days it was mostly text, and now it's increasingly images and moving images, which are much, much larger files, and it becomes more difficult to sift through movies or sound clips than through text. But Echelon at the time was revealed to be capable of searching basically everything online. And so activists created a protest, an international protest day that was called Jam Echelon Day. And it wasn't activism, it wasn't hacktivism, because nobody knew exactly where Echelon is located or how to slow down those computers. The only vector, the only possible attack would be to just send a lot of things that, first of all, heighten awareness that there is such a thing as Echelon, that there is somebody listening systematically, eavesdropping, surveilling. And secondly, once you have people's attention, to use that in an aesthetic way. So in this case, poetry, software-generated poetry. You want to have something to listen to? You want to have something to surveil? Here's some poetry. Not hacktivism, because it doesn't actually mess with the technical apparatus of the people setting up Echelon. But on the same day, October 21st, 1999, there were other actions that you could participate in. You could participate in any number of different protests around the world to mark your participation in Jam Echelon Day in your particular country in a more or less technically involved way, and either get people to use more encryption or other privacy software like a VPN, or to protest against the participation of your country's security services in Echelon, etc. So I hope you see what distinction I'm trying to draw between what is and what isn't hacktivism. When somebody inserts a message for Ramadan in a calendar that ostensibly is the one for the British Prime Minister, that's just sort of a political manipulation. It's trying to get people to believe that Tony Blair has signed this message. Yes, it is defacement of a site, but it's not necessarily what I would call hacktivism. But what is perhaps something we can recognize as hacktivism is when there was a lot of problems between Estonia and Russia. They share a border. Estonia is a very small country that doesn't have a lot of military defense. And it was going to declare itself independent as one of the former Soviet republics. And in order to prevent that from looking legitimate, there were some Russian hackers who interrupted their systems, their voting systems, and even defaced their websites. Right? So you see, I'm trying to be neutral and not just have certain kinds of ideals represented here, but even in some cases a Russian hacktivist attack can look like hacktivism too. That doesn't mean that I endorse it. It doesn't mean that I would be happy if Russia takes over Estonia. It just means that in my view, this kind of strategy represents what I would recognize as hacktivism. There's an artist called Trevor Paglin who originally studied geography, mapping and mapping with satellites. And the more he studied what geographers do with the help of satellite technology, the more he found out about global surveillance infrastructure. So he started guiding tours that would bring people very close to Area 51 or other famous areas that are restricted access, and where there's some satellite or other installations behind, or to tours to where the internet cables are going into the ocean from the coast. So he's documenting global surveillance infrastructure as an art project, taking photographs and taking satellite pictures, and then making art installations. Now that does interfere with the desired invisibility of that infrastructure. Right? It wants to see you, it does not want to be seen by you. But I wouldn't call it hacktivism, because not only is it mostly old media, photography, that he's using, and the art gallery, but it's also not necessarily interfering with their technical profile, with their technical presence. It would be very difficult to interfere with a satellite, but just telling people about satellites, selling photographs, selling T-shirts, making an art installation in a gallery is his practice. It's not necessarily hacktivism, but it is artistic activism. But what I think is hacktivism is when there was political trouble in the Indonesian East Timor region, and there were a number of people around the world who wanted to interfere with this by hacking pages that were defending what was happening there, by sending a different kind of message that says, this should not be trivialized. There is ethnic cleansing going on. There's political suppression going on. We might call this fascism, or we might call this dictatorship, or whatever. So it's political expression. It's political rhetoric. It might be quite aggressive, and it does actually interfere with their technical profile. So I would say that is hacktivism. On the other hand, here is a timeline of activities in 2015 by a group that was calling itself the United Cyber Caliphate, pretending to be Islamic radicals and attacking various US interests around the world, in the Arabic Gulf, but also in the US. And passing themselves off as ISIS, hacking Newsweek's Twitter feed, threatening President Obama, targeting Twitter accounts of military spouses, etc. It turned out after a while that this was actually not some political interest group, some independent group of people, but this is actually Russian state-sponsored, military-trained hackers. Right? So for that reason, I would say that yes, it looks like it's hacktivism. They call it hacktivism, but in this case, it's just pretending to be hacktivism. It's actually state-employed people. We actually have eventually been able to see them hacked back. The same thing happened with some Chinese hacker outfits. Eventually, somebody hacks them back and finds a way to access their camera on their computer, or the camera in front of their building, and shows their faces and shows them wearing uniforms and shows them showing up at 9 and leaving at 5. It's their job to pretend that they are ISIS. They're not ISIS. They're Russian or Chinese agents pretending to be interfering with US Twitter or with the federal courts, etc. So I don't know if you can read the small writing on this slide, but we'll distribute the slides later. So if you want to study the timeline of this, which is kind of an analysis after the fact of their activities in 2015 and 2016, particularly active in those 12 months of 2015, and then it tapers off because they were increasingly exposed, revealed to be Russian agents. So it looks like hacktivism, but it is not hacktivism. And before I take a little break for everybody, I'm going to go around the world. This is not just something that happens in certain corners of the world. It's a global phenomenon. It's certainly true that recently most of the hacking from China has been state-sponsored, but the first hacktivists in China were, in fact, patriotic. They were simply Chinese computer literate people angered by anti-Chinese riots in Indonesia. We know that there's a lot of Chinese people around Asia and in countries like Indonesia. They tend to be relatively well-to-do, they're successful, they have connections with China, they can do business. They become targeted. There's some racial resentment among other Asian countries. So these anti-Chinese riots in Indonesia got some people in China angry. They formed various groups calling themselves Green Army or China Eagle Union or Hong Ke. And they emerged from patriotic bulletin services. Anybody in Brazil still use a BBS service? It's technically still possible. It's an older way of congregating online in a forum. BBS basically technically works differently from the web. The web is also a decentralized net where any of our devices could be not just a client but a server, serving up something that you have to show, that you have to say. But mostly today on the web, we have gotten used to the fact that we use our devices just as clients and that the server is somewhere in the cloud of a powerful provider, meaning it's not just one computer but a cluster of computers serving up because there's a lot of demand for Netflix or CNN or whatever might be served up in the cloud. But technically you know that each one of your laptops could be serving a radio station or a website or both. Now BBS is similar except it insists that everybody who participates is always a server and a client. So if you participate in a discussion group on the BBS on a forum like that, every time you connect, everything that's on that forum is copied to your computer. Right? It's as if you were connecting to Facebook and you copied all of Facebook onto your computer. It would be too much, but with a BBS in the old days, it was pretty easy. It would just be text messages and only the ones that you subscribed to that you were interested in, like all the subreddits, right? And instead of just looking at them, you actually copy them onto your hard drive and everybody else can look at them now on your directory, right? So it's a different structure, but it used to be very popular before the mid-90s, and it's still available. So these groups all contributed to early internet defacements, distributed denial of service attacks, and even credential thefts targeting any kind of adversaries, anybody who they think is against Chinese interests. Right? Especially in 2001 when Hong Ke managed to send down the White House website, the US White House website. They generated enough traffic in a denial of service attack that the US White House, in 2001 websites were not very well defended. It was relatively easy to achieve with a few hundred people networking their computers. Today I bet the White House is quite a bit more resilient because they're probably served by Amazon or by Microsoft clouds. Not Amazon anymore because Trump doesn't like Bezos. They must have gone over to Microsoft Cloud, Azure. But nowadays, taking down a government website would take more than a few hundred people participating. But in those days, it was quite easy. And that was in retaliation for the collision between a US spy plane and a Chinese fighter over Hainan a month earlier. Final slide before we take a break. Politically motivated cyber campaigns have emerged also from Russia, although I think it is true to say that most such activity from Russia now is state-sponsored and not individual citizen groups. These monitors keep going out. I'll have to read from behind me then. They can often be shown to be linked to at least government support. Even if they're not directed by the government, they will get government support, and the same thing is true for Chinese hacktivism. One of the earliest purported hacktivism events emerging from Russia resulted in a series of distributed denial of services acts and other intrusions, as I just mentioned, targeting Estonia. Initially attributed by some people to hacktivists, very quickly it was clear that it was actually the state. In 2014, there was a Russian group, Cyber Berkut, that rose to prominence after they managed to do that to NATO websites. The North Atlantic Treaty is a military defense alliance of Western countries and European countries especially. So their websites were taken down by Cyber Berkut, and they pretended to be a Ukrainian group because Russia always has troubles with Ukraine, so they're going to say, we're going to pretend to be from Ukraine. But later analysis, both textual and contextual, was able to link the group not just to the Russian state, but the GRU, which is the secret service of the Russians in particular. Now, I'm going to take a break and then talk about a few things about Brazil that I've been able to find out. And who knows, maybe there's some people here who know who to ask about more of the things that have been going on in Brazil. And I'm eager to learn about that as well. But let's take some 10 or 15 minutes for oxygen and nicotine and caffeine and all the rest of it. But remember your social distancing, 6 feet apart. Thank you. Okay, so let's continue. To summarize quickly, I wanted to make two distinctions. One is between malicious hacking and hacking in the service of activism, of political speech. And the other one is between hacktivism that is genuine protest and state-sponsored activities that pretend to be a hacktivist group, because there's a lot of that as well. And you may or may not be convinced about my trying to make a lineage, a connection between anti-war protests or animal rights or human rights protests and what's going on online, so maybe we can discuss that. But I want to get into what I know, what I've been able to find out about Brazil, and then maybe some of you who are looking at journalism, communication, PR, can also contribute. To my knowledge, much of Brazil's hacking community initially participated in web defacements, right? So they might not all call themselves hacktivists, they're hackers, but many of them initially participated in what I call hacktivism. They were often initially conducted for fun or just to embarrass and chastise certain administrators for their poor security configurations, but they also often targeted organizations that were involved in political scandals or contributors to environmental disasters. So there is some level of hacktivism in Brazil to express outrage at corporations, at politicians. And when we talk about that, we often talk about a group that is present in many, many countries. If it is a group, it may not be a group, it may just be a name for many different groups. We talk about anonymous. Anonymous has roots in various forums, discussion forums, and anonymous activity in Brazil initially called for the distributed denial of service attacks against political organizations, right? So the denial of service is simply slowing down or taking offline a particular website, a particular computer that is the front, the web-facing front, the web face of a particular political organization. And some of this kind of activity even prompted, a few years ago, a formal investigation by the Brazilian Federal Police. Once you have that level of attention, it's not surprising to see that those kinds of targets become more secure, they become better defended. As I mentioned before the break, instead of having one computer serve your website, and that computer can be vulnerable, you can go into the cloud, which basically distributes the ability to serve up that website. So now, if I'm trying to target the website of Unicinos, let's say, or agua.com, it's no longer the address of one computer that I can find out. It's maybe I can find out how many computers it is. Often I don't even find out how many. It could be 10, 12. They could rotate. And on the other side, Gustavo is going to sit on the other side, a defending side, and he says, oh, Peter is trying to take off this computer. I'm just going to send that computer to other tasks, and I have 3 other computers that are going to serve up our Unicinos website or agua.com. And as fast as I am to react to that, he's going to be faster to defend. So this distributed denial of service tactic has become more and more ineffective over time, which has encouraged hacktivists to become more aggressive and actually try an intrusion. An intrusion meaning like I break in behind the firewall, behind the defenses. I try to find out names and accounts and take data and leak them to embarrass somebody or to accuse somebody about scandals or disasters. The groups in Brazil that seem to support the cause of Anonymous as an international, very informal affiliation of people with similar sympathies have been targeting corrupt politicians or companies involved in corruption or election candidates, but also the Summer Olympics in 2016 and the World Cup in 2014. Now you might think the Olympics, that's like maybe a corrupt organization, but it's an international, all nations want to celebrate sports. That's not very political. Why would you want to target that? Or FIFA, yes, maybe FIFA is not a very clean organization, but everybody loves that sport. Why would you want to disrupt that? It's precisely part of the definition of hacktivism that you simply try to seek attention. Right? It's not necessarily against FIFA or against the Olympics. It's just as much or more for attention to a particular cause. So in the same way in which if we all stood in front of the building or blocked the street access to Unicinos in protest of something, it's not necessarily against Unicinos, it's just trying to get as much attention as possible to whatever our cause is, which could be to save the rainforest, which is nowhere near Unicinos, but we would get attention. Maybe the newspaper would cover it, maybe TV would cover it, maybe the radio would cover it, maybe social media pictures would pop up of us standing with signs, because we are at a symbolic spot, which could be the Olympics or the World Cup or a public square or a street or whatever. So just focusing on Anonymous, which is the red the most prominent graph on top, if you look at how much they've been associated with hacktivists, cyber attacks, and compare that to other groups, you'll see that it's by far, internationally speaking, the biggest group or the biggest affiliation. Like I said, it's not a formal organization. Any of you could go online right now while I speak and find an anonymous forum. I'll show you in a moment where they probably are in Brazil, and participate in their discussion and do what they ask you to do. So you don't have to train, enroll, or pay up to be a member or whatever. And you can do that one day and never again, or you can do it every day. So Anonymous is not really a group. Unlike some of these other groups, the Syrian Electronic Army, they're probably not in Syria, they just call themselves that way. Al-Qassam cyber fighters, they want to sound like it's an Arabic affiliation, but we don't really know. Lulzsec was a split off, the second from the top on the right, Lulzsec. Lulz, I don't know if that translates into Portuguese, but lulz means, you know, I'm doing something for the lulz, I'm just doing it for a laugh, you know. So it's making fun of information security, it's making fun of cybersecurity. It's making aggressive fun, it's playing pranks against anybody who's concerned with cybersecurity. So Lulzsec is a group of people who found that Anonymous and other groups like that were too lackadaisical, too haphazard, too improvised, didn't go far enough. Lulzsec wanted to be more radical, more active, more aggressive. And as a result, they were also more easily identified. And some of you might have heard about this. One of the organizing members of Lulzsec, Hector Monsegur, was eventually trapped by the FBI and forced to turn informant, and turned in a lot of the other people who were participating in Lulzsec activities, which is why you see that graph disappear. But what's interesting about all of these groups, Anon Plus Italia, Lizard Squad, Ghost Squad, Shadow Brokers, which may or may not be a political, not hacktivist organization, they all have trended down in the last 2 years. 2008, a rapid drop. 2019, even more of a drop. So we still talk about hacktivism, but there's been a lot less proper hacktivism in the last couple of years. And that's partly because sites are becoming more secure, more well-defended, but it's also partly perhaps because people are maybe a little tired, disappointed with the lack of success of many of those activities. There's still quite a bit of Brazilian participation in web defacements. So there's one particular site, Zone H. Zone H allows people to report what they have been observing or participating in. And again, you probably can't read everything that it says here, but you see that it's marked with different national flags. And there's a lot of Brazilian activity in web defacement still, even in the current year. Brazilian groups have defaced more than 1,250 web pages to date. And in the Brazilian, what they call underground, even though they're not moles or voles or pimply teenagers, it could be beautiful female people in the 5th floor. So they're not underground; they're just sort of metaphorically under cover. Common motives have changed quite a bit from initially just having some fun or warning administrators to much more articulate political activism. And in Brazil, the theme corresponds to most of the current headlines in newspapers, going from natural disasters maybe to do with the Amazon or with pollution, to political scandals with the current government and its various officers and their relatives, and so on. Many of the most notorious Brazilian groups have emerged in the last 20 years and still continue in an era where they were mostly organized through IRC, Internet Relay Chat. Is there anybody here who uses Internet Relay Chat? It's another older format online. It's a way to connect with people, not through a website or social media, but through an older format that is quite simple. And there's some groups, such as listed here, Prime Suspect, Silver Lords, Insanity Zine. I don't know why they all have English names instead of Portuguese names or whatever. Crime Boys, I guess that's cool. They're engaged in website defacement, whereas there's some other groups that have identified themselves more as in the area of hacking, unsecurity or unsec, and its various spin-off groups like the Clube dos Mercenarios or Front de Scene. They're active enough to organize their own gatherings, their own conferences. Several of them actually have annual gatherings in larger cities. And they've also been talking to the media occasionally. In a series of interviews in 2001, there was an investigative journalist in Brazil who interviewed the web defacement groups of that time. Remember, that's when when e-commerce websites were a new thing and where they were not very safe, and it was pretty easy to attack them. So it's not surprising to see that most of the actors then were pretty young. They were teenagers, between 15 and 22 years old, student age, high school age. They might not have been particularly proficient on a computer or in website security. They just thought it was fun to download something from the web that somebody else had made available and participate in their activities. More recently, in 2010 and later, when coordinated anonymous groups began their activities around the globe, you could see some of that also happening in Brazil. First in support of Wikileaks in the second half of 2010, and then continuing in different forms. Now, probably everybody's heard of Wikileaks. Raise some appendix if you have never heard of Wikileaks, because I can explain that a little bit quickly, but the Wikileaks is an organization that was, for the longest time, operated by Julian Assange until he had to go into hiding in the Bolivian embassy in London. They were, in 2010, just fresh off publishing various things that embarrassed diplomats around the world, that embarrassed various governments. And the reason why Anonymous decided to support WikiLeaks was pretty simply because various finance arms in the United States had been directed by the State Department to not process donations to WikiLeaks. So if you in Brazil thought it was kind of fun to support WikiLeaks because they embarrass politicians in your country or abroad, you could send them a PayPal donation, or you could use your credit card to send them a donation in support of their work, because they don't make a profit on it. They have volunteers working around them. And the State Department had directed PayPal to no longer process donations. And a lot of people said, regardless of what you think of Assange and his hairstyle and his lifestyle, and regardless of what you think of the leaks and what they reveal, it is surely a bad thing to say we're going to cut off people's donations just because we don't like the direction of that donation. It's basically, especially in the US where money is speech, you're basically taking away the right for people to speak freely. I should be able to give my money to anybody I want to. It's my money, and if I want to give it to you, why should the State Department prevent me from giving it to you? So in protest against that, there was some very large-scale activities by Anonymous, and it really is what gave Anonymous a lot of publicity. It got them a lot of attention, which also means that they got them a lot of participation from people around the globe who thought, you know, even if WikiLeaks is stupid, the State Department is more stupid. You know, they deserve to be punished, they deserve to be embarrassed because they're trying to prevent people from their expression of free speech. So they became very, very active between 2011 and 2015 with global operations that usually had lots of support from local groups, including in Brazil. And like I said, in 2011, Brazilian federal police probed the activity of Anonymous in Brazil because multiple government websites were targets. Again, I'm going to say that websites are not computers, right? If I take down a website of an airline, it's very different from taking down an airplane. If I take down a website of a bank, it's very different from taking money from the bank. If I take down the website of the local water district, it's very different from poisoning the local water supply, right? One is an actual criminal attack, terrorist attack. The other is just a symbolic act of protest, right? That's the difference I would make between hacking, malicious hacking, and hacktivism. One is a political act of protest and free speech. The other one is a terrorist attack. So even though the Brazilian federal police felt that it had to come after anonymous members in Brazil because they were taking government websites down, a government website is no more special than a poster. And if I put spray paint on a poster, I have not cost anybody anything. It's just a mustache on a politician's face. Now, it's important to notice that these Brazilian hacker forums are not necessarily on the web. Partly because, as I said, they're older than the popularity of the web. They might be using IRC or BBS formats that are older than websites. You know, remember, the internet is older than any of us in this room. The internet goes back to the 60s. So there are many older formats that make distributed and somewhat anonymous forms of communication possible. The Chinese underground is similar to Brazil's. Russia is less so in that way because they're less centralized in that way. Chinese cyber criminals tend to rely on local apps, phone apps like WeChat or QQ. WeChat has become extremely dominant in China. You can use WeChat to pay your groceries. Nobody accepts cash anymore on the street in China. You pay with your mobile phone, and the way that you load the phone with credit is by WeChat. So it's WePay or Alipay, which is the Alibaba alternative Chinese monopoly. So QQ and WeChat are chat apps that have become pay apps and many other things. So that's what the Chinese rely on. The Brazilian hackers seem to be relying mostly on WhatsApp, or if they're a little bit more security conscious about their groups, they go into Telegram. But it's changing based on social trends in general, what are people in general using, because you don't want to be too separate from, you need to recruit new members all the time, so you have to be able to be found somehow. Right? So you're not going to be hiding where nobody can find you. But WhatsApp and Telegram are currently pretty popular. And access controls to these forums is not as strict as, for instance, in the Russian-speaking underground. like I said, because they want people to join. They want to be found by the right type of person, whereas in Russia they're much more paranoid. But because the Brazilian groups are scattered among Telegram and WhatsApp groups, information about them is not as well organized as in Russian-speaking forums. So people who research this currently can find out quite a lot about Russian activities just by joining one of those forums that has most of the information pretty centrally available, whereas in Brazil, there's multiple groups and you don't know if they're coordinated, if they know of each other. Maybe they operate completely separately and they only meet once a year at most at these conferences that I'm going to talk about. In Russia also, in the forums, there's no distinction anymore between political hacktivism and for-profit hacking. So in Russian forums, and you can look at that yourself without knowing Russian. I don't know any Russian, but Google Translate does that for you. You can actually find what they would do and what they would charge you to do it. Right? So you can actually hire, if you seem plausible to them, you can actually hire Russian hackers to go after certain people or do certain things. And they actually posted the pricing for that. I have not seen any Brazilian hacker groups be that enterprising. They don't seem to be into making that a business just yet. So as I mentioned, internet relay chat networks and bulletin board systems from the 90s are still popular in Brazil, and they became more prevalent than web-based forums and chats. At least in the first half of this past 20 years, they were the forum of choice. And there you did find some advertisements for products and services. For instance, we can get you credit card numbers, etc. And IRC servers operated by groups called Silver Lords or Full Network were basically ruling the underground for that first decade of this millennium. And more recently, there's been a very popular IRC client, the MIRC. That's also become the name in Brazil for that IRC client. Become very popular among all types of users. And BrazIRC and BrazNet are the most popular networks there, and they have channels that you can see. That's where the first threat activity in Brazil tends to emerge from. Intentionally flooding those channels, which is a kind of denial of service attack, even though it's not a web server, so it doesn't work quite the same way against the IRC server hosts, or sometimes even taking over usernames or other kind of coordinated attacks. Many Brazilians seem to look to either Guia the Hacker or Forum Hacker as a good way to immerse yourself in network and information security. But as I said, because the real activity is in those other forums, the majority of entry-level hackers would not be able to enter either a white hat or a black hat community that way, because those parts of it tend to be invite-only, and so are the conferences. There are a couple of different conferences that you can find out about. SakiCon is one that takes place in Sao Paulo every year, again by invite only, but since 2012, promoted by the organizers of the Hackers to Hackers conference, H2HC, which has been taking place in Brazil since 2004. And the organizers of Lulzsec, which is a conference more for the entry-level student or security professional, also tend to support SakiCon as one place to get together. That's kind of similar to HOPE, which is an international conference, Hackers of Planet Earth. The logo is HOPE, H-O-P-E. It's been taking place in New York for many years in a row. Of course, probably not this year because we're canceling everything, but these kind of things tend to be long-lived and go from one year to the next, because people love connecting a face to something like a handle or an online name at least once a year. There's another Brazilian conference, invite-only, that has taken place in Sao Paulo since 2007. That's much more professional. It's not like these other conventions that are aiming at the entry-level security professional or the student. You Shot the Sheriff is much more like DEF CON in the US, which used to take place every year in Las Vegas. And that's got a lot of different tracks like lockpicking or hardware hacking. In Brazil, I'm told the conference venue is always a bar for You Shot the Sheriff, so I guess the group is not as large. DEF CON attracts hundreds and hundreds of people in Las Vegas. If you want somebody to really ruin your life, you should just attend DEF CON as an innocent citizen, because you will be hacked from left and right. And one of the most popular things to do at DEF CON, and I bet they do this at You Shot the Sheriff as well, is to play Spot the Fed. So you try to find out which one of your attendees, we could do this in this room too, which one of these people here in the room works for the government. And you try to prove that they are not who they pretend to be. So you try to hack them as much as possible, right? So that's why I said it's a good way to be messed with, because we all carry devices with our phones, laptops, etc. Even credit cards, passports now have all kinds of Bluetooth and near-field capabilities that are readable unless you carry them in a special wallet. People can take your information and then do things with that are usually quite unpleasant. So that's much more serious hacking level. There's one more conference in Brazil that takes place in a different city, namely in Recife. It's also invite only, and it's explicitly black hat. Right? So do not go there hoping to hear from the Brazilian government trying to explain cybersecurity or trying to explain the future of 5G telephones, or trying to listen to a bank talk to an internet provider about how they're going to improve services. That's explicitly for vulnerability exploitation, for new hacking tools, and what's called the zero-day vulnerability disclosure. Is that a phrase that you've heard in Portuguese, zero-day vulnerability? That's sort of the holy grail for hacking, is to find a vulnerability in the software of a particular operating system for a computer or a phone that has not been disclosed yet, not even to the manufacturer, meaning 0 day that is known. So when you find it, there's no defense against it yet, because Microsoft, Apple, etc. don't know about it yet, or have not been given the chance to patch. Right? One reason why the best thing that we can do as ordinary citizens is to always upgrade our devices. As annoying as that is, there's always a possibility to upgrade your software. But that's how your phone and computer providers try to protect you against many things, including the so-called zero-day vulnerabilities, where a computer specialist has found a way to trick your computer or phone into doing things it's not supposed to do. So the interesting thing is that unlike SakiCon, which is kind of open to the public and open to other languages, AlligatorCon in Recife is exclusively Portuguese and exclusively black hat. So only go if you're an alligator, I guess. And the interesting thing, though, is that even though there are other Portuguese-speaking countries, of course, around the globe, Angola, Cape Verde, Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique, Portugal, Sao Tome, there seems to be no interaction between anybody in those countries and Brazil in terms of hacktivism. There might be some contacts that go mediated through English but there's not such a thing as an international Portuguese connection. I find that curious. I mean, I know that Brazilian Portuguese is somewhat different, but surely not as different as a different language would be. But there don't seem to be any international alliances between hacktivists in Brazil and hacktivists elsewhere. And the reason I say that's curious is because there's often regional conflicts like those between Israel and Palestine, or Serbia and Kosovo, or still currently between India and Pakistan, that have sparked hacktivist groups locally on various sides that have attempted to shut down or deface websites belonging to the opposition, going back to at least to 2008. And they often get support from abroad. They often get support from other like-minded people in different countries who may share a language or share a heritage or just share the sympathies. So it's curious to see when that's not the case. It's more likely that it is the case. It's more likely that hacktivism today is something that crosses borders pretty easily. But like I said before, there's also some groups that pass themselves off as local hacktivist groups, but they're really actually employed by state governments. So the Al-Qassam cyber fighters or the Syrian Electronic Army, they do cooperate with more organic hacktivist groups. You could say they're using them to participate in international hacktivist operations, but they do that very selectively when it's in line with the goals of that particular state. Iran seems to be very, very active in that. Iran has a number of ways of indirect presence in a number of countries, not just funding them covertly or overtly, but supporting them with technology, with training, and making it seem as if it's not Iran who's behind this, but it's a local group that's behind this. In a similar way to what I was talking about last time when I was talking about information operations. So we can see that in the last decade, the number of large-scale international operations associated with what we call hacktivism has first gone up astronomically, right? So in particular, Anonymous and its protests against PayPal and the State Department got a lot of wind under its wings internationally, not just in sympathy with WikiLeaks, but in sympathy with a lot of other local protests that Anonymous was going to make its own, sometimes very local, like American protests against Church of Scientology, sometimes very global, like protests against certain multinational oil companies that are cause oil spills time and again, etc. The interesting thing in that is that whether you look at Google Ngrams or any other kind of graphs tracking the mention of the term hacktivism, or journalistic reports or analysis, political analysis, technical analysis of hacktivism. There's some think tanks that cover cybersecurity. All of them seem to see a dramatic decline in hacktivism after 2015 and 2016. So you could argue that it's just a return to normal, and it was an unusual period. It blew up internationally. Activist groups are normally small sets of regional actors targeting very specific organizations to protest very regional events. There are some nation-state groups operating under the guise of hacktivism, but even that has gone down quite a bit. I don't know if those of you who work on cinema might remember that North Korea hacked Sony and found all kinds of embarrassing emails, which cost several people at Sony film studios their jobs, pretending to be, of course, within the United States, pretending to be coming from disgruntled employees, and it was only found out later that it was, in fact, North Korea. But mostly what we see in hacktivism is, it's going to be somebody who's authentically a local, regional group who authentically has a complaint against a particular corporation. And it's usually not a cat's paw of a nation-state group from abroad. You could also say that for the decade from 2010 to now, the attack vectors used by hacktivist groups have remained largely consistent. Right? Those are the 4 different techniques that I was talking about before. Distributed denial of service. It doesn't work as well anymore, but there's still people who do it. There's a tool that you can download. I will not put that on slides because I don't want to be, and I'm not streaming this lecture because I don't want to be on track on record as having mentioned things like this. But there's a tool you can download. For instance, low orbit ion cannon. Low orbit ion cannon. It's just a weird name for sci-fi people. That will install on your computer, and you can participate with that in distributed denial of service attacks. It just automates generating lots and lots of requests. It's like asking a range of computers the same question thousands of times per minute. So I don't recommend downloading low orbit ion cannon. I'm just saying you could do that. Most likely, if you do download it, somebody in Brasilia, will take down your name and say, she downloaded this today. But they can't, if you do it right, they can't prove that it's you because you've already heard from me that you should use a VPN. And that maybe you don't do it from a computer that you always carry with you. You use a different computer in the computer lab, etc. But people are still doing this. People are still trying a distributed denial of service attack, even though it's less likely to succeed, precisely because the most likely targets, namely corporate websites, institutional websites, are more likely to be in the cloud, meaning that not one computer to attack. It's a fluctuating number of different computers that all can serve that website depending on demand. And if the demand goes up, Amazon or Microsoft Azure simply promise, you're running a bank, your website will never go down. On a normal day, maybe we only need to use one computer to serve the demand, but should the demand go up, legitimately because you have a lot more success in business, or not so legitimately because you have millions of protesters trying to take down your bank, there'll be 1,000 computers available to serve your website. It will always be available. You will never disappear from the web because a cloud provider can guarantee that. So people still try it, but it's less likely to succeed. The other 3 attacks that are increasingly more technical are we also still see people trying to do, but it's less popular. It's just less likely. Right? So if you look at media mentions, including social media, which are much more difficult to track. Yes, we know how to scrape Twitter feeds and so on, but just looking at newspaper websites and other popular venues, hacktivism-related cyber attacks are mentioned much less in the last 2 years, almost as little now as they've been 10 years ago. And also, if you look at the number of different groups, identified groups of hacktivists, and remember, individuals could be members of several groups. Different groups could pretend to be larger than they really are, etc. But there are certain groups that have been active, and by active I mean they usually have a Twitter account or 2 that might change, but they have one that, because they need to say, we did this. They want to claim certain kind of actions, especially if they succeed, but even sometimes when they don't. They take responsibility for things through a Twitter account or some other, an Instagram account, some other place where they can pop up quickly without necessarily being tracked. So a number of those groups also has seen a precipitous decline after 2017. So it's kind of gone out of fashion almost in the last 2 years. And then if you look at the source that reports this, you can also see that not only is it less likely to be reported in the media, mainstream news, which is the green track, it's also peaked in social media around 2016. And social media in this graph just means Facebook and Twitter. And any other sourcing, which is everything that you can capture, it peaked significantly in 2016, and it's been on the decline since then. So that in itself is curious, but it allows us to say as scholars, as academics, that now we can actually start studying this because it's not just something of the present. We have some historical distance. We can observe 2 decades of trends. We can observe that between 2000 and 2010, there's been a consolidation around certain notions of what this means, what this may mean, what this should mean. People were struggling around the definition of hacktivism. The term was coined in the 80s and used in the 90s, but it was really the early 2000s when it became used widely. And then you see the second decade from 2010 to today, where it plays out as a very, very lively scene of political activity, protesting against corporations, against environmental and other embarrassments, and against particular politicians as people or political platforms in general. But recently it's been kind of in decline. And the groups have actually been in decline since 2013. So one of the explanations that we can give for that graph is, as I mentioned, there have been some arrests in 2013 and convictions, and that has had a pretty significant impact. It's deterring people from conducting sustained operations. Even if you were involved in those, you're less likely to continue being involved. I mentioned the Lulzsec leader and coordinator Hector Monsegur, who was pressured into cooperating with the FBI, which resulted in multiple arrests of fellow members. And similarly, members of Anonymous in Singapore were charged with crimes in 2013. Singapore has some of the strictest laws. I don't have to tell you about that. Singapore, you can't even spit on the sidewalk or chew chewing gum in public. So you can imagine that doing something like what these hacktivists were up to is not going to be taken lightly. Separate to that, as one reason for the decline, it's not just about public prosecutions, but there's also been quite a lot of reports of infighting. Reports of infighting started as early as 2011 and continued into 2013, suggesting that there was likely a fracturing of Anonymous. And I've already mentioned that that's one of the reasons that there's a group called Lulzsec, because they just decided Anonymous, these people are not serious, they're just playing. Lulzsec is going to be more radical. Lulzsec is going to go after more difficult targets. Lulzsec or other groups like that are going to be more careful about their operational security. They're not going to be as amateur about it. They're not going to be as part-time about it. Or we're going to start some cells organized in a much more rigorous ways that are capable of doing more damaging actions or more notorious actions. The legacy of all of this for journalism in general, or public relations in general, or media in general, is that we still operate with a set of stereotypes or misunderstandings of people who know their way around computers, right? And I said, in the 80s, hacker was actually a term of praise, right? In the 80s and 90s, calling somebody a hacker meant you praise their native intelligence, or finding out how to operate a computer without studying a manual or taking a class, how to program a computer without formal training. And it's increasingly become under pressure, under political pressure, it's become a derogatory term. It's become a term that basically criminalizes that activity, even though I would argue that it's still an innocuous desire to learn and to express yourself. And it shouldn't be criminalized that you learn how to operate a computer. But computers have also changed. Computers and their operating systems and our networks are much less open. They're not really anymore about educational or pacifist goals. They're much more about commercial goals or goals of crowd control. So these days, when you see the word hacker or hacktivist, often the association and the way that the terms are used suggests that these people are stealthy, these people are elitist, right? So the invite-only conference, it's only people who are, skilled, who can speak the language. It's people who are highly individualistic. They're not really a collective. They're just sort of haphazardly banding together. The accusation also goes that they're protective of their expert knowledge, right? It goes along with the elitist thing, right? So the populist rhetoric about the threat, the endemic threat that hacktivism is that they have some knowledge, we can grant that, but they're too protective of it. They don't share it with the authorities, they don't share it with the police, they don't share it with the corporations. They just try to show off. And they're opposed to public deliberation. They don't really help Parliament to understand. They seem to be really disinterested in the norms of civil society. They're just kind of ironic to see the terms used that way, because the original motivation for somebody to engage in hacktivism is actually the opposite, right? You're not being stealthy if you protest. It's the opposite of being stealthy. You're trying to attract as much attention as possible. You're not necessarily individualistic or opposed to public deliberation if you engage in a political act. That's actually trying to intervene in public deliberation. But with this language, with this kind of pejorative pushing away the motivations of hacktivism, we see the branding of people who know their way around computers as not interested in norms of civil society because they want to change what the norms of civil society might be, because they point to flaws in the norms of a particularly, apparently very civil society, and the flaws might have to do with politics or politicians or corporations or consumptions. Right? Like I said, it's true that there's not a one set of beliefs that you will find in everybody engaging in this. Not every activist is equally an animal rights activist and a human rights activist and somebody who is defending their nation against slurs from abroad or whatever. They're very different motives, but it's a similar tool set. And all of these tool sets converge, and it's hard to tell whether you're using them to enrich yourself or to damage people, or whether you're using them to try to enrich your society and fend off damage to your society. So, as I like to do, in the last slide, I try to point out a place where you can go for a lot more knowledge, a lot more information. In this case, I can't think of a better place than the Citizen Lab. Citizen Lab is run by a professor at the University of Toronto, but it's not actually operated or owned by the university. It's just a loose affiliation of people. Ron Deibert, D-E-I-B-E-R-T. Ron Deibert is the person nominally in charge, and he will publish academic publications about the activities of Citizen Lab. But they also have, and he's a professor of political science, if I don't recall incorrectly, but he also has computer scientists, data scientists, activists collaborating with him. They have a professional level skill set that's actually able to analyze cyber espionage by Israel, by Iran, by various other countries. So, they have a high level of analytical and technical skill and a high level of political awareness that allows them to expose and publicize certain things. So they are, for instance, trying to enable open net initiatives in places where the net is not open. They are the place where, if you're a journalist anywhere in the world, an investigative journalist, and you suddenly find that there's some weird things going on with your phone, with your laptop, if you want somebody to analyze whether you've been hacked, whether you've been compromised, Citizen Lab is a place where I would go. Citizen Lab has helped a number of different journalists from many different countries. They're not just helping one side against the other. They're neutral. They've been saying, send me your device, show me what happened, and we will try to analyze how it happened, whether you are compromised, and if you are compromised, we'll try to find out who did it and then expose maybe why they did it. So Citizen Lab is at the highest level of analysis, academic analysis and technical analysis of hacking and hacktivism. And even though I'm trying to keep those two terms separate, increasingly the boundaries have been blurred because the tool set is often the same. And we've learned in undergraduate classes that there's such a thing as an intentional fallacy. Right? Just because somebody says, I didn't mean to do it, doesn't mean you can't still give out 8 red cards at the end of the game. Just because somebody says, I didn't mean to damage something, doesn't make them a hacktivist. It could be that they have been a malicious actor in this case, even though they try to hide behind a political, more innocuous motive. So the boundaries are blurred more recently, precisely because the much more innocent tool set of just a protest, of just a blockage, of just a march, the equivalent of a sit-in, a virtual sit-in, or a march, or a congregation online, which could be the distributed denial of service attack, they've become less and less effective. Right? Our online attention is much more compartmentalized. We don't necessarily see everything that's going on, even in Porto Alegre anymore. We only see what's reported on our particular social media, which is automatically filtered, right, for your age group, for your economic background, for your academic interests, etc. So there's much less of an inclusive public sphere to appeal to for hacktivists to get a lot of attention. We can admire, whether we like her or not, we can admire Greta for getting international attention, for environmental protection, and that's an outlier. There's a lot of people who are trying to support that as hacktivists online to get attention for environmental concern or anti-global warming. It's become really difficult, precisely because a lot of us are tired of hearing it. We've become kind of inured to it, etc. So the tool set has become more technical, and the more technical your tool set, the more likely you are to be confused for an actual cyber criminal. Right? So that's perhaps one of the reasons why there's been a downslope in the last 2 years of hacktivism proper. Some people persist, but they are no longer as successful, and some people have moved on to be something that I wouldn't call hacktivism any longer. We do have some time for questions from 6 feet away, but if not, then have a great weekend. And if this is the last time I get to appear in person in front of students ever in my life, I can still say that it was fun, despite the fact that I'm speaking in a language that's foreign to you and you in a language that's foreign to me. But there's one question here already.
Hello. Quanto ao último comentário do Peter, porque a gente está acompanhando aí, né, o dia a dia, as decisões da universidade. Por enquanto está tudo mantido, né? Então a gente espera contar com o Peter aqui ao vivo na segunda-feira à tarde e também à noite. Mas enfim, né? São tempos bastante dinâmicos. Well, Peter, eu vou fazer minha pergunta em inglês para aproveitar, treinar um pouquinho. I'll try it in English, my comment. Yeah, you want to hear it in Portuguese? No, go ahead. So, no, I was really, it really called my attention, the drop of the work of the hacktivism movement. And I was thinking about all this decade from early 2010 and the increase, what could it have to do with the movements that we saw, such as Arab Spring, Occupy Wall Street, and other similar to them that kind of spread among themselves this idea of people being able to use their phones as weapons of mass circulation, which is a sticker I found on a software company once. And if somehow the hacker movement or the hacktivism movement try to surf that way alongside with these movements, because I recall in Brazil when in 2013, when we had protests that were very heterogeneous in terms of thematics, but somehow they led to Dilma's impeachment, but they were concerned with all sorts of things. There were such of anti-government, anti-party, very, in that sense, kind of dangerous in that way. And by that time, we had lots of videos on YouTube by the anonymous group saying things, and that takes me to a second comment about how these hacktivist groups construct themselves with imagery, with sound, with these videos, maybe as important as the technical work they are doing to turn down a website or something like that. They are a symbol of something that maybe happened around that time, and I'm trying to think about, and suddenly these Arab Spring, Occupy Wall Street, other sorts of protests around the world, they had their peak, but maybe because they didn't have a specific theme. I remember watching the series Newsroom from Aaron Sorkin, and then it was a very good series, and in one episode the theme is the Occupy Wall Street movement, and the guy who's the news presenter, played by Jeff Daniels, he speaks to the girl that is representing Occupy Wall Street and telling her that the movement has no grassroots, has no focus. Of course, it is debatable, but I guess it says something about the time we're living, that the idea that constantly on the youth we have this opportunity of maybe turning things upside down, like in '68, or maybe during Vietnam War and other times, but somehow it broke down and maybe took the hacktivism movement that tried to ride that wave together with them. Just a perception, a comment about these things that, starting with your graphic and thinking about it.
Thank you. Those are two very important angles. So even though in the first few slides I tried to argue that hacktivism has to do with a type of protest that's anti-war protests or free speech suppression or whatever, I don't mean to suggest that those are the same people, or even that the people who would have been at an anti-Vietnam protest then would now encourage themselves, their friends, or their children to do this online. I just wanted to draw an analogy between this as legitimate political activity that is done in the hope of social change. Your examples are very good, but not easy for me to deal with because they all fall into a different category. So Occupy Wall Street was one of the last very high-profile in-person coordinated demonstrations around the United States and many other places. At the same time, what that group, if it was ever a fully coordinated group, seemed to aim for was entrance into politics, not just protesting against politics, but really enter into. And some alumni from that have since then been elected to political office locally, and some even, at least sympathizers with it, have been elected to national office in Congress, etc. So I see that as slightly different from the protests against the World Trade Organization, where there was large-scale riots and protests in Seattle and elsewhere. When those meetings were held on U.S. soil, there'd be a lot of people showing up in protective gear, ready to battle the police or ready to battle the security forces that are defending the national and international trade representatives. I don't think those people ever aimed to enter into politics. I don't think those people are going to be running for office trying to change platforms because they don't feel that they can change their global order. They just yell, they rail against it. Now, hacktivism is kind of in between, right? Any of the actions that I've observed online that are protesting against oil spills or against globalization or against global surveillance or whatever it might be, have neither had the ambition to really change the discussion in Congress around it, although that's where it should go, you could argue, nor have they just simply had the effect of blocking an event or making something impossible that is taking place. They're sort of in between, and that might actually be the real weakness of online activism. Your only audience is the couch potato. Your only audience, you're appealing to people who are already passive. You're appealing to people who are sitting watching Facebook stream by or Twitter feed stream by, and it's already less likely that they will join in your cause, right? If you walk by a group of Occupy Wall Street protesters and they ask you to sit down with them and block the street, you have a decision to make. Will I cross or will I join? Right? If you come across somebody picketing, you have the choice between crossing the picket line or joining the picket line. But if you're online, your only choice is, do I watch this because it's cute, or do I scroll on and watch some cats play with, So your audience is already less ready to engage, and that's the real difference, and you're very right to point to that, between an anti-war protest or an Occupy Wall Street protest on the one hand, that can be very personal, where you actually are aware of taking a physical risk, where you're actually much more perhaps bonded with the people who are there, and any kind of online protest. The most recent example I can think of are the protests in Hong Kong. We're not reading about them anymore much, but they are going on. They're still going on. There are still students on the street. There's still people from the economically disadvantaged classes in Hong Kong who are protesting against various things, and precisely because their representatives have been barred from entering into a political dialogue. Some of those people were actually standing for election to city council, etc., to do a debate with the representative of the People's Republic of China about the future of Hong Kong, but they've been sometimes under pretense, sometimes because of certain laws, they've been prevented from being elected to representing Hong Kong people in politics. So they have no recourse but to stay on the street. It's much more comfortable to do this from your couch on a laptop. You take less of a risk. The only risk that you really take in certain authoritarian countries, like the United States, has become a very authoritarian country in terms of computing, is that you can have, there can be a raid on your house, you can lose your computer. If you can show that you haven't actually broken any real laws, that this is just political speech, then maybe your computer will be returned, maybe not. A lot of the online hacktivism that I've seen recently was not necessarily in sympathy with those kinds of causes, but much more selective, either about causes that are local rather than national or global, or about causes that are so large that it's impossible to decide that this is the spot where I'm going to stand or sit down or lie down. And the most notorious example might be all the protests online in support of Edward Snowden against surveillance, against international surveillance. And here in Brazil, you have one of the supporters of Edward Snowden in Glenn Greenwald, who is, of course, not just a supporter, but also one of the mediators, one of the first journalists who got in touch with Snowden and who helped reveal some of the things that Snowden exfiltrated from his employers. And now, in turn, of course, Glenn Greenwald is also uncomfortable for politicians in other ways, and he's been making himself unpopular with the security services here in Brazil, and has recently been accused of things that fall under the anti-computer crime hacking kind of law. But then luckily he's been cleared. So he, because he is a journalist, he operates as a mediator, he operates as somebody who will volunteer to accept information and then disclose it, but he doesn't actually go into your house to get it, right? So it's a difference between breaking and entering into your room or your computer. That's a crime. But if somebody else broke into your room or your computer and then gives me the information, then I am not guilty of that first crime. But I can disclose the information, right? So that was a distinction made. So a lot of people are engaging in hacktivism that's basically in symbolic support of people who take real risks. So it's at one step removed, right? It's therefore slightly less effective than an immediate action. But with cases like global surveillance, it's hard to know, whether that's less effective than something you would do in person, because in person you can only do so much against a multinational structure. So I don't know if that answers any of this, but you're right to point out that there's not a simple filiation or lineage from the free speech movement or the anti-Vietnam War movement or Occupy Wall Street to some of the causes taken up by online activists, which is why I tried to give examples of many different ones: pro-Chinese, anti-Chinese, pro-Russian, anti-Russian, pro-US, anti-US, etc. Anybody who wants to get together a small group and identify a target and finds visibility can try to do that in a hacktivist way. And it's far easier to organize than to physically organize, to transport people to a certain spot, etc. The last thing that I think that I at least heard you say, maybe you didn't say it, but I understood you to say it, is the difficulty of organization physically with phones or with messaging, etc. And in the Occupy Wall Street movement, there were some efforts to engage technical experts who would come and teach groups on an ad hoc basis on, how can you use various platforms to organize the next meeting without being overheard, without being blown, without being exposed to, whatever it is you want to avoid. And the same thing is happening in Hong Kong. They were using various apps, and then they see those apps being banned from the App Store. They were using various cell phone networks, and then they see those cell phone networks being blocked by the authorities. So it's a little bit of a technological arms race, and that has also weakened hacktivism. Right? It's not just that websites have become better defended, it's also that local and state authorities have become better at understanding Telegram, WhatsApp, etc., and they can try to mitigate your ability to bring together hundreds or thousands of people in one spot simply by making that more difficult. They can't make it impossible, but they can make it more difficult. So in-person protests are targeted that way, just like hacktivism coordination is targeted that way. Some of the big forums that used to be a hunting ground for people who are sympathizing with Anonymous were actually commercialized. They were sold. So 4chan and 8chan were two notorious forums online that gave rise to some of these groups. They've been sold to commercial interests, and those commercial interests, of course, have no sympathy for somebody using that in an anti-corporate way. That's not profitable. So that's been on the decline as well. So I think we're right now seeing an era maybe of a few years of retrenchment, where people are rethinking how much, how useful the internet can be for political speech, for protest, and there might be a return to more in-person local protests for that reason. The more aware we become of how we're being tracked by our phones and tracked by websites, the less likely we are to organize politically difficult situations through our phones or through websites. It might be a better idea to put your phone in a Faraday bag or leave it at home and just go out to the street and yell. That might be more effective in some situations. But there is still some hacktivist activity with very selected causes when you can more easily pinpoint, not like global surveillance where it's difficult to attack somebody, but if it's about animal rights or if it's about certain other single issue politics, I want to avoid this law from being enacted. You know who to speak to, and you know how to speak to them. And politicians have also become, I think, more receptive to that, so that you don't have to attack their website and deface their image to get their attention. They have learned that these are voters too, and if there's going to be thousands of them, I'd rather that thousands of them vote for me next time because I helped them, than that thousands of them take my website and make it unusable for a couple of days.
Outras perguntas, comentários?
Meu inglês não é que nem o do Fischer para me garantir. Quando tu falou em hackativismos e tudo mais, uma das ideias do meu projeto para o mestrado é falar sobre contravigilância, iniciativas da sociedade, enfim, contra algoritmos de vigilância. Um exemplo básico é aquele Clear Vision, que já tem polícias lá dos Estados Unidos utilizando. Eu gostaria de saber se tu já tem mapeado ou se tu tem consciência de alguns grupos ou iniciativas que atuam contra o poder do Estado na área da vigilância da população. Se tu tiver, eu vou pegar, anotar e seguir estudando, ou outros estudiosos ou referências bibliográficas para isso aí. Obrigado.
I don't really. I mean, personally, my time of involvement with this is quite a while back, and everything that I read about now is also with mostly with a historical distance, because that's how academics are. They wait a little bit before they are sure what they're talking about. So anything about the current situation and about actions and counteractions is difficult to find out. The only place I would go is forums that are currently going on, or eavesdrop on some of the venues where they get together and see what people are currently concerned with. But there are many reasons why it's become more difficult. There are many reasons why any online free speech activity, not just protest, but any kind of use of the internet has become less open, less free. Some reasons are technical, and some reasons are international corporate policy. But I think also people have become a little tired of the outrage industry, and in the end, hacktivism is about trying to generate outrage, anger, and then channeling that into a protest. And we're just inundated with so many outrageous things, and some politicians have become very good at being more outrageous tomorrow, so you forget how outrageous they were today, that people have just become less likely to follow up on things, because this, in America it's called whataboutism, right? So the moment you want to hold somebody accountable, a company, a politician, a corporation, a local official, you want to talk about that, and they just say, yeah, but what about that? And amazingly, it works. Because I guess we all have attention deficit disorder now on the internet, and that whataboutism just like distracts us enough to prevent us from following up doggedly on the one issue that might galvanize some action. Right? So examples do include actually the Occupy Wall Street movement, where some people said it's no longer a serious movement, I want this to become something that is politically actionable, which means I have to be able to sit down with somebody. I can't just yell. I have to be able to be electable. I can't just be, living in the street. I have to be able to raise money in support of an election, which means I can't be against all sources of support, etc. So it waters down, perhaps you could say, the purity of those protests, or it translates them into something else. And that's one reason why that fizzled. It didn't just stop, it wasn't suppressed. It was, the oxygen was taken out. And some people who wanted to be serious about it and long-term about it have managed to do that. And we now have at least one congresswoman, perhaps three, depending on how you count, in the United States, who are proposing a Green New Deal. It has something to do with it, taxing Wall Street and restricting Wall Street in order to fund more environmentally friendly policies, which you could say probably would not have happened without those protests, but has left those protests far behind. And similar things are happening around energy policy. As soon as you realize that just protesting against coal or oil isn't getting you to the solutions, then it's not a protest to be in favor of solar, or in favor of wind energy, or in favor of other solutions. So it becomes a different conversation. And counter activities only have something to do with that. Suppression of organization, of the right to gather, etc., only has something to do with that. But I did have one slide up there that said that, at least in the American context that I know best, the Patriot Act and certain kind of post 9/11 regulations have given the state more ability to know where you are, when you are, what you're saying, and therefore they're less likely to be surprised by anything. Less likely to be caught in an embarrassing situation by anything, because it's not a secret. right? So the culmination of all of that is that currently this week in the United States, politicians are about to vote on legislation that would make end-to-end encryption illegal, which would take away the possibility of having confidential, secure forums online under the guise of preventing all kinds of bad things, extreme bad things. But nobody's paying attention to this debate because we're all distracted by the coronavirus, so it may actually pass. And I'm a little worried about that because it's going to be a significant step back in terms of the privacy and the dignity of individuals and of groups who might want to have an open and free conversation about their beliefs. So there are some counter measures that you can point to. They're not necessarily anti-hacking or anti-hacktivists. They're just anti-free and open society. And anytime that that's the case, whether in Brazil or the United States, protesting online or offline is not enough. You need to be fully engaged in however those kinds of laws are formed. Any other questions? That's a good note to end on, I think. But thank you very much for risking exposure to all kinds of dangerous ideas that are like a virus. Go spread them some more.
Temos mais alguma questão, comentário? Se não, thank you once again, Peter, and esperamos nos ver todos na segunda-feira. Se cuidem.